support, which is gays and lesbians, but also that's one. And then second, Republicans are gravitating toward this too, even though there's no science. That's what's the irony, right?
Exactly.
Right. And so you can see the changes. It's almost 50% of the public are willing to say homosexuality is caused by genetics, even though the science is highly conflictual and not in agreement. So I've never been a believer in saying facts matter in politics. And
Witness
yeah, witness any election.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what exactly was the rhetoric behind the poll? Like, how did they define homosexuality, especially as distinct from, like, say, bisexuality? Or if you think of sexuality like a spectrum, like, would me, like, kissing someone of the same sex qualify me as a homosexual? Would I self-identify as a homosexual?
Right, right. Well, in this particular view of things, and I will not give you a satisfying answer here, this is I'm dependent as a researcher on what Pew Center asks. And the questions are highly general. And what they're really asking the respondent to is identify homosexuality themselves. So they're identifying it in whatever way they do. Some people have a much more nuanced view than others. I think there's a general understanding of it, and it's definable for most people, but then others have much more, there's more categories, and the spectrum exists as well. Remember, this is also, 2003 is a long time ago in terms of this history, and a lot of things have changed since then. But they still ask the question that way, so they're not breaking it up in that way.
Right.
Totally great question, but we're subject to how they ask this. In political science in general, this was not something that was studied very often. Sociologists gave it some time, psychologists some, because the individual level analysis, but political science only came to this slowly in around 2004, because it suddenly was in, not just in the news, but in a presidential debate. Yeah?
What about marriage between two homosexuals? Is that legal? Have you studied that?
I haven't studied the gay marriage question. Is it legal? It is in most states.
Yeah, sure is.
Really?
Yeah.
Can-
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to try to do the political thing, because this is the part that intrigues me. You have an absence of facts, so we're talking about beliefs. So Democrats believe at a higher ratio that it's genetically based.
Yes.
Republicans believe less so. What are the two-party politics that lead them to this different position? What is it about Democratic politics that puts them where they're at? What is it about Republican politics that puts them where they're at?
I think
That's the politics.
right. Like I said, one is that overwhelmingly the actors here, the homosexuals, vote for Democrats. So it's an advantageous view for Democrats in that regard. So just straight out raw politics right there.
Get the votes.
Yeah, and keep them in our coalition. The other thing would be that the view of choice, individual kind of assessment of a cause, that it's your choice you made, it fits very well with the Republican ideology. That it's like a free market view, if you will, behavior. You got a choice to make, and you can make it. You're held responsible, right? Those kind of values are very much in the conservative viewpoint.
But
Go ahead.
I understand the thing about Democratic political leaders in terms of getting the vote. But if you walk out in Lawrence, Kansas, and just talk to Democrats who aren't necessarily basing their attitudes on what kind of votes it's going to garner, a lot of them believe that this is genetically caused. So it's not just about getting votes, it's about something else in Democratic politics.
Yeah, I don't think it's just vote. It's about civil rights. It's about equality.
Okay.
And all of that fits with the Democratic view,
Okay.
and particularly for this group that was oppressed for years, and those kind of things, absolutely. But I'd go back to this question too. Another part of it is, once it becomes an elite view for the parties, it becomes a top-down kind of socialized process. I'm a Democrat, that's how I believe. So there's not a lot of thought involved for some. Now there's other aspects, like we just mentioned, civil rights, et cetera, that the Republicans don't necessarily want to extend to this group. They didn't want to change, Republicans don't want to change laws about gay marriage and things of that nature. So the issue-based part of it is for real and important. And that's probably why it's being driven, continually driven, regardless of what the science, right? Because it's very advantageous for a group, civil rights. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the religious right holds a
Yeah.
greater sway on the Republican Party
Right.
than the Democrat. And they've got enough influence where it is going
Right.
to affect it.
Because this is this is not status quo, right, in religion, and it's not supported by the religious right, at least many of them, this view. And so, yeah, I'd be totally against that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Something tells me that it's a matter of whether they believe in that behavior is controllable.
Yes.
I think Republicans generally think that behavior can be controlled, and Democrats do not believe that as much. And
I agree with you, and this was,
it's hard to formulate. I've just now been thinking about it. But there's a definite, it's almost as if the Democratic Party is more accepting than the Republican Party. And on the other way to maybe say it is the Democratic Party is more maternal and the Republican Party is definitely more patriarchal.
I think you hit it on the head. The controllability issue is key. If you look at, that's the way to think about this issue, because like there's some studies a long time ago, what causes poverty? Democrats tend to assign environmental causes, right? Institutions, that people fall into cracks, and that Republicans tend to assign individual issues. They don't have a work ethic, lazy, that kind of thing. So in one case you can control your behavior. Republicans believe you can control your behavior. Democrats are more of structuralists. They see the structure influencing behavior. You see the same thing here, right? And in this case, Republicans saying you can control your behavior, you have a choice. Democrats, it's hardwired, you don't have a choice. You're being who you are. Very similar to that when you think about it in terms of controllability. It's exactly how I would think about it too, for sure. Did you have?
Yes. There's a common issue now about the use of restrooms by homosexuals. Have you looked at that?
I haven't. I've heard about it.
Transsexual.
I haven't researched it. I haven't really given it too much thought, but yeah.
There's some places where they insist that you go into the restroom with the sex that you are born with.
Yeah, but that's not homosexuality, that's
That's
transsexuality.
Transgender.
That's not about homosexuality, that's about transsexuality. And that's something very, very different. Very different. One of the other subtleties in this is that when you talk about genetic causality, you're jumping to behavior, because what the genetic question isn't whether it causes the behavior. The genetic question is whether it causes the sexual orientation. And the behavior it follows on that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why for example, a Catholic priest may be a homosexual, but choose or elect not to act on that ever in his life.
Good point.
So there's the piece of the business about jumping from genetics to behavior is troublesome to me, because it leaves out the kind of core question about sexual orientation.
It would be better labeled the way you just suggested.
Yes.
Some in the literature use behavior, and that's probably why I picked it up.
Well, I
But it is,
understand that, because
Right.
I understand why they jump, but they're leaping over another fundamental question that's much more closely linked to the genetic question
mm-hmm.
than behavior is linked to the genetic question.
Right, because behavior, it's an action.
Exactly.
And orientation
It's
is
a state.
it's
of
state,
being.
right? And you don't have to act
Right.
like a priest.
Well,
what
this gets pretty deep.
Sure it is.
It is. It always does. You know, these are pretty interesting questions, because I always thought that in my own field, there's lots of stuff. University of Nebraska is the center for showing genetics influences political attitudes, and that ideology is supposed to have a genetic component. And I immediately went, if this is true, I don't have a job anymore, right? I mean, it's supposed to be social science, right? Not biological. So, but they do twin studies, and it starts looking like an entirely different science. And political science, and I'm sure the fields that you were in, maybe not, but our field's always been influenced heavily by every other field. And there's pockets of those fields, economics, sociology, different history at different time points. So right now it just seems like biology is kind of the big discipline, and a lot of different disciplines are joining with it. Not just social science, but physical sciences, physics, chemistry. There's a lot of joint things with biology, and that with the human genome and all the things that are going on there, you're just going to see a lot about this. Whether the science is in agreement or whether there's actually a fact here, it might be less relevant politically than how people perceive it to be, right? And that's what I think is interesting about this question of attributions. The only other thing I'd mention here is immutability. The question within the literatures was, if you assign a biological explanation, do you believe that, in this case, whether I don't know about orientation, but whether the behavior can be changed? Should be orientation, but whether the behavior could be changed. Do people, when they say it's genetically based, do they also say we can't change that person, that behavior can't be changed, so immutable? And nobody had looked at this. It was kind of assumed, but nobody had looked at it, and there was actually a question that I found. I was able to look at it. And in fact, that's the case, not for everybody, but here's the question that was asked. Do you think a gay or lesbian person's sexual orientation, not behavior, sexual orientation can be changed or cannot be changed? Cannot is the #1 response in 2003, but just barely. It's below a majority. You can see it's changed to over a majority believe that it's increased. That increase dovetails nicely with the increase in the genetic attribution itself, which has risen in popularity. So as one rises, the other does as well, and they are related. And so I think there's some, let me just take a step back, there is some danger in this. Right? If people are hardwired, and so if in the future, 20, 30, 40 years, when they can manipulate genetics and manipulate how people turn out, so to speak, will they pull the genetic genes associated with certain behaviors, or will they want to? Whether there's got to be facts here first, but all sorts of things. It used to be many, many years ago, we didn't describe things genetically at all because it wasn't reasonable to. It used to be much of the inequality in society was justified because nature made it that way, right? And we've moved from that position. But now we're moving back toward a genetic kind of fixed, predetermined outlook on behavior. Because it suits the political circumstances of today doesn't mean it will tomorrow. Right? It could backfire. Some within the gay, lesbian community don't like these explanations. They don't see it that way. They also would agree that the science isn't there either. And they think things are more fluid than that. And so this is what we see today, but it doesn't always mean it will be that way, I think.
In 20 years, the goal may be to use genetics to fix heterosexuality.
Yeah, right, you don't know. I mean, actually the future's here now, and a lot of things are vastly different than I would expect than when we were looking at the 70s, when both parties agreed it was all environmental, and there was no real issue about it, right? So this is just one of the final slides, but it just shows that if you choose a genetic attribution, in 2003, 30% roughly chose that genetic attribution as the cause of sexual orientation. Almost 80% of that 32% would say it cannot be changed. And you can see that as that increases, 43.6% shows a genetic attribution for 2012, and then that rises to almost 86% of those who you cannot change the behavior. So they go together, and it's not just a static public opinion here, it's moving in a particular direction. And this, right now, it's more favorable toward gays and lesbians in terms of the group. Yes?
Can you say something about how these belief systems form cultural stereotypes?
Yeah, I can. This is, I'm not presenting this in big detail because I'm not as confident in some of the results, but the literature here is pretty interesting. That is, a genetic explanation implies or provides a nice basis to stereotype, because these traits are shared by people who have those genes. So it makes logical sense that you could, create over generalizations based on those shared traits. So the psych literature shows that if you are primed to think about a genetic explanation for someone's orientation or behavior, you in turn will stereotype that behavior, or that group who performs that behavior more likely than if you used an alternative attribution, like an environmental one. And so, in that sense, stereotyping is generally not a positive thing and can be negative. That if you're using a genetic explanation, you might see more stereotypic judgments about people because you think that those traits are not only stable but fixed and they're shared by a group. Did I answer that?
Yeah, well, the fascinating part of that is that, again, the answer would vary a little bit if you were talking about genetics related to orientation. That's a more fixed state,
Right.
Which may not lend itself to stereotype at all. Whereas if you jump from genetics to behavior, where there's a huge amount of variability,
Mm-hmm.
go to any gay nightclub, just all
Right.
kinds of variability. You may open, in your reasoning, would you be open to more stereotyping or less?
More.
Behavior would be, yeah.
I agree. I got a slide I can show you, but there was one question. I'm just not happy with the questions I had to deal with, but there was a stereotypic question here about, it's a stereotype around gay men in fashion. They dress better.
Right.
Okay, so the question is, if you use a genetic explanation for sexual orientation, do you in turn use that stereotype more often than if you use the other attribution? Right there is the question. Do most gay men have a better sense of style than most heterosexual men, or don't you think so? 43% of the sample thought that was true. Okay, that gay men just dress better. I think there's a whole lot of variance on gay men dressing.
Oh, geez.
But the stereotype is, you see it on television, the characters, etc. Right?
Right.
And so down here, if the individual had chosen, in the same poll, a genetic explanation for homosexuality, they were more likely, 51% were more likely to agree that gay men dress better than those who had choice. Only 40% would have agreed with that. So that's an example of a stereotype. It's more of a positive stereotype than a negative one. But there is the use of stereotype based on the attribution you choose. Yeah?
And I'm not sure about this, but do gay and lesbians statistically have higher incomes? I thought I'd come across that at one
Yeah,
time,
good.
but I'm not sure.
Then heterosexuals?
Yes.
I
Because that
don't-
would be a reason to want them politically, but it would also be a reason why you can afford to pay attention to style, because that
Oh.
usually means it costs more.
Right. I hadn't thought about it, and I haven't checked on it as a group.
Yeah, if I came across it, I can't remember where.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I actually, now these aren't my questions. but I searched a Google search, gay men stereotypes. This is one of the first ones that came out. So it is in the public mind, this kind of dressing better kind of idea. They didn't ask kind of questions I think would have been more interesting. But again, that's, you know, I wish I had a grant to investigate everything I wanted, right? You know, we always wish we could ask the questions, but I don't. So,
With respect to the question he was, about income, I think I've seen research on it, and there aren't major statistical differences across orientations. What is different is that because of a variety of things like stereotyping and that sort of stuff, is that gay lesbian folk use their money differently. And the use of that can give the appearance of having more. For example, gay tours or gay, they go on ships and that sort of
right.
thing. Or they get together at a resort,
Right.
feel safe,
Mhm.
and that can give the appearance of more income, but it actually isn't. It's
Right.
just that they're using their money differently, mostly having to do with safety.
Right, that's a good point. That's a good point. Just the conclusions. So when you use a genetic explanation for homosexuality, you're more likely to believe that that behavior, that orientation cannot be changed. The genetic explanations also, to a certain extent, influence stereotypic behavior, or stereotypic judgment, made by the public. And finally, I think this evidence in general I kind of presented here suggests that the public's beliefs that genetics cause homosexuality is a pretty important variable in terms of continued support for the group, at least currently. And I think it has been shown to be a very important variable for the rise of gay marriage as well. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I'm sitting here beginning to wonder why anyone does this research out of the responsibility side of things and the law side of things. They must be thinking that this kind of homosexual behavior is a threat or does harm to somebody or something. I just wonder what the underlying motivation is
For what?
for doing all this research. You say the science is not proving.
No, the science about causality isn't there, but the science about attributions and behaviors and stereotypes is very relevant. But it doesn't take data